Hello, and thank you for joining me for today's episode of Big Ideas in Eating Disorders. In this series, we hear from people from the field of eating disorders who share with us their personal and professional journeys, reflections, their big ideas that never quite get represented in this way in standard academic publications and conferences. I'm Kathy Pike, a clinical psychologist and professor at Columbia University, and I'm your host for Big Ideas in Eating Disorders. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Professor Ann Becker. Dr. Becker is Dean for Clinical and Academic Affairs and Maude and Lillian Presley Professor of Global Health and Social Medicine and Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. She's trained as both a psychiatrist and medical anthropologist, and we'll talk about what that means and how that's shaped her research career, which has focused on social and cultural factors associated with eating disorders, social barriers to care for mental disorders, and school-based interventions. Dr. Becker is the former co-editor-in-chief of Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry, and former associate editor of the International Journal of Eating Disorders, and past president of the Academy for Eating Disorders. Dr. Becker will talk with us today about pioneering work that she has done in Fiji and how that has further informed her understanding of culture and psychiatry. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Anne, let's get started sort of at the beginning in terms of your growing up years, and maybe what were your interests and what might you have done if you hadn't become an anthropologist and psychiatrist?
This is way out of the range of what you expected, but I always wanted to be a meteorologist, and that will have to come in a different life. But I actually started college thinking that I would be a linguist, and started by taking courses in sociolinguistics, which just fascinated me. And I quickly learned that that wasn't going to be the right path for me, and I wanted to have a broader view of societies and how people made meaning within their communities. And so for me, that was anthropology.
Mm-hmm. So you started out as an undergrad in thinking it was in linguistics, but pursuing a degree in anthropology. And then how did you get from anthropology to health and to mental health?
Well, I should probably back up because I started college in 1979, and back then it was not a given that a woman would graduate and have a professional career. And I think for that reason, we were really steered toward charting a course, and you sort of had three choices: medicine, business, law. And for me, my father was a physician, my mother was a nurse. I had three older brothers who eventually went into medicine. Of course, I didn't know they would at that time, but they all became psychiatrists. So you can see where this is going. I felt like I had to do this path. This was the pragmatic thing to do, but I always wanted to do something a little different. And right around that time, some of my mentors and eventually some of my colleagues had gotten interested in how, much more interested in a sophisticated way in how culture and social norms shape illness experience, help-seeking behaviors, et cetera. And I thought, okay, this is it. This is perfect. I can do both. So that was kind of what got me started. And of course, I have to credit my mentor, Arthur Kleinman, who really blazed the trail in this way. And he's actually still a mentor of mine. So thank you, Arthur. That's a shout out to Arthur.
So, Anne, let me just make sure I heard this correctly. You have three brothers and they're all psychiatrists. So the four of you, when you get together, is psychiatry? That must be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, it often is. I will say that. And yet I think that the common thread there is that we're all just really interested in understanding people and hearing people's stories. And actually, my brothers have done very different things in the field of psychiatry from me. So we're not, clones or anything like that. But yes, we do talk about the field a little bit when we get together.
I can imagine. So you said you wanted to pursue psychiatry, but with a twist, right? From a different angle. When you got started, did you know that angle was about eating disorders, or what was the angle that was different that you wanted to pursue?
Yeah. So for me, first of all, I don't think I even know what eating disorders were. And in fact, I don't think bulimia was even, formalized as a diagnosis until I was starting college. But there was a lot of, chatter about disordered eating then, and a lot of interest in it. So I was drawn to that, but actually, my interest in body image, I think, came a little earlier. When I was a teenager, I was diagnosed with scoliosis, curvature of the spine, and I lived in Milwaukee, where the Milwaukee brace was invented. And I had a very conservative and very caring treatment team who put me in this back brace, which was very clunky and visible. And I had to wear it for 8 years. So for me, I was, as a teenager, I was always thinking about how I would wear clothes so that it kind of, minimize showing this apparatus. And of course, as you can imagine, that's something that's stigmatizing for a teenager. Although I had really great friends, and I think I was pretty much buffered from that. But it really, at that age, I thought a lot about how people present themselves to the world and how they, write scripts and pursue narratives that position them. And, of course, I wasn't thinking about it in those terms as a teenager, but it really was very, very interesting to me, for personal reasons. So later, when I started to gravitate towards psychiatry, and especially when I started my ethnographic field research in Fiji, I got very interested in body image per se, and specifically around the dimensions of weight and shape.
Tell us how you got to Fiji and what shaped the work that you did there, the studies that you did there.
Yeah, well, I got to Fiji in a completely serendipitous way. I was studying anthropology, as I said, as an undergraduate, and I just really, really wanted to go to the Pacific Islands region. That was the sort of birthplace of ethnography, and of course, the great anthropologists Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict had done their work in that region. And then, I was really fortunate because I kept trying to find people who could make introductions. And finally, a friend knew someone who had been a Peace Corps volunteer who had lived in a village, and they introduced me. And I'm, writing letters and sending them by post, of course, because there's no email back then. And I found these incredibly generous hosts, generous meaning, they just said, sure, you can come stay with us. That's completely fine. We're not really sure what you'll be doing when you're here, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. And so that's how I got there. But, so percolating in my mind then was, were all these issues around sort of, for me, what my body experience had been, this disconnect between the way I saw myself and the way others saw me, and trying to bring them, sort of into alignment. And so this was running in the back of my mind. And when I first got to Fiji, I wasn't at all, I wasn't studying body image. I was actually was very interested in sort of the way that women in the communities were responsible for fishing. And there's a lot of gender segregation in Fiji, and women in many ways had soft power, but not a lot of authority. And so I was interested in how they created collectives. And so I hung out with these women who were, fishing all the time. And I heard, I wasn't able to understand them initially, of course, because they weren't speaking my language. But what I did take away from that, as I'm thinking about these body image issues, was that I became sort of a topic among them, and it was around what I looked like. And as you can, my clothes were different, my hair and skin were different, everything was different, and they were just interest in talking about it and drawing comparisons. And initially, as you can imagine, that was a little a little uncomfortable for me. But it's also human nature. But for me, what was so interesting about this was how public the discourse was. It wasn't covert at all. And a lot of it was around what I was eating and whether or not I looked, like I had gained weight. And so I started, I don't remember exactly when it was, but I started to register that people, when they greeted me, would say things like, "Oh, you look great. You've gained some weight." And I wasn't, I was what I think I was a normal weight back then. But what they were saying was, "You've gained more weight, and now you look to us, more like we think someone should look." And so I was fascinated, not just around, the compliments around weight gain, which of course we never really had in the US, but more that people would be so direct about it and so affirming about it. And so when I went home and eventually, decided I would do my joint MD PhD in medical anthropology, I wanted to go back to Fiji and understand this better. So that was how I got to this topic in this place. And the thing that makes me smile now is that when I went back to sort of set up my field research, it was sort of a reconnaissance trip. And when people said, "Of course you can come back, but P.S. you should really get married and have some kids before you do. You're getting kind of old."
Another way in which they were very direct and explicit about what you should be doing in your life or how you should appear in your life.
Exactly. They had the power of direct comments. But when they said, "What are you going to study?" And I said, "Well, I'm just fascinated by how, attentive everyone is to body size and how interested people, are in whether or not people gain weight." And they looked at me and they said, "Yeah, no, that's not really a thing for us." And so, again, pointing out that this was, it wasn't that they said, "Don't come," because that doesn't interest us. They just said, "No, you've got us wrong. That's not something that we're so interested in." So again, this sense of it was so normative.
So, Anne, you're going back to Fiji and you developed a whole research program there that to a large extent got captured in a book that you wrote, Body, Self, and Society, The View from Fiji. Share with us highlights from what you learned as you dug in to what was going on in Fiji around body image, self, and society.
It took me quite a while to get to a point where I could actually talk to people in their own language about these very sort of personal experiences that they were having with their bodies. So I started off with a lot of observation, which was, partly in response to me and this whole chatter about people were worried, if I didn't finish my dinner, people would comment on it. In fact, I remember once, we'd had some octopus soup for lunch and it was delicious, but we'd had it like every day for a month. And I really had enough. And the chief of the village came walking after me and said, I noticed that you didn't finish your soup. Is there something wrong? And so these kinds of, and this would happen quite a bit actually with commentary about children in particular. So if children weren't eating well, or if they didn't appear to be growing as well as people wanted them to, there would be a lot of social commentary about what kinds of social losses or neglect or stressors might be driving this poor weight gain or poor appetite. And so as I looked into this more, what I came to understand is that weight gain was really a concretization of how well someone was cared for and fed within a community. And so it was a way of embodying social care. And so when a person, a child, a guest, or anyone gained weight, it wasn't so much a reflection of their personal adequacy in, matching or attaining a cultural aesthetic ideal. It was more about reflecting that they were situated in a caring and dense, strong social network. And the takeaway there was, and I'll fast forward a little bit because it took me a long time to understand this. I first went with a very simplistic idea. Oh, okay, their bodily aesthetic ideals are for robust, large, well-fed bodies. That's why they don't seem to have eating disorders here. And that's why they're not bothered by gaining weight. And actually, it wasn't quite that at all. So some of that was true. But what it turned out was that people didn't aspire to match the aesthetic ideal. They didn't feed themselves up so that they would be large, not at all. Instead, their position on that was, well, my body is my body. I don't really control what it looks like. Other people have some control over that. And some of it is just the way I am and the way I was born. So what was the, sort of the flash of insight finally for me was that not so much that there was a different aesthetic ideal, and maybe that was protective against eating disorders, but that there was a different aesthetic ideal, but people had a different relationship to that ideal. It was something they could admire and point out. Yeah, that's beautiful, but, has nothing to do with me. Nothing to do with me at all. Eating disorders at the time in Fiji, and this is in the mid 1980s, there wasn't an indigenous category for them. It was clinically, it didn't seem that they were there. Obviously they could have been missed. There was one case report where someone was, very low weight, could have been anorexia. But what was more convincing to me that there, apart from the clinical records and no indigenous category, was the very sophisticated chief of the village at the time, a woman who was also trained as a health professional. She was a midwife. She had been in health centers all her life, and she was so perplexed when I described what eating disorders were. And she said, no, we absolutely don't have those here. And she said, but look, I'll tell you what, if you have them in the US, send them here. We'll treat them for you, because no one in Fiji is going to have something like that. So it was just, inconceivable at the time there. And of course, so I was guided by this notion, what is protective about this milieu? And I got it wrong, right? It wasn't that there was a different bodily ideal. It was that there was a different valuation of what a body should look like and what aesthetics meant, right? Appearance was not something that people thought about a lot, except to admire it. And, maybe it mattered at a certain time in your life when you were thinking about getting married. But even then, not so much. Marriages were arranged traditionally. And so people were, the other thing, Kathy, is that, and this will sound strange to someone who is from America, as it did to me at the time, is that people said, oh, you don't really own your features. You don't get to decide how to cut your hair. That's for your parents to decide. And this idea that people would be autonomous and make choices and self-agency, just, it was so different there. And that, of course, had a bearing on eating disorders as well.
So am I hearing you correctly? Is the takeaway, what piece of what I hear, Anne, and I've talked with you about the work you've done in Fiji many times, but every time it takes on, I feel like I understand more this very fascinating perspective that tells us a lot about Fiji, but also tells us a lot about other places in the world, including our own societies and cultures. But part of what I'm hearing you say is body shape and weight. The meaning of that in some ways belonged to the community, that the community took pride in having members who were well cared for, and having a community of people who had large body sizes meant that we as a society are taking care of our people. Is that a piece of what you're saying? And
Yes.
that the body image itself wasn't driven by the individual trying to achieve something and having agency, and sort of the body being an instrument of demonstrating something about myself, but actually is something of a marker for the community on how the community is doing. So it's a story of collective, as you say, versus individual, and it's a story of what's a difference in terms of what's driving the meaning around this larger body shape.
Kathy, that's a really nice formulation. And let me give you one more example of that, that I think nuances it a bit more, which is that a lot of this, it's not that there aren't different dimensions of why people care about bodies in Fiji. It's how those dimensions get valued. So as an example, one of the things I did for the book was to present people with, everyone has seen the gradated cartoon shapes of different body sizes. What I did was I created, something that looked more Itauke Fijian, and I basically cut them up and I shuffled them and I presented them. I had a lot of help, presented them in random order to over 400 respondents to see, which ones were considered beautiful. But again, that was the wrong question. So I did ask about attractiveness, but I also asked which one has the highest quality of care. And so what you could see is that with the very large shapes, which would probably be read as obese in other contexts, the large shapes would have the highest rating of quality of care, but maybe not as high a rating in attractiveness. But again, what did they value locally? They valued the quality of care. So attractiveness, it wasn't that people couldn't see that, well, this person looks like she's marriageable or, whatever it was. It was that wasn't valued necessarily.
Mm-hmm. So you spend this time in Fiji, get the insider's view, take the time to really, from an ethnographic perspective, understand more fully what the meanings are and what's going on. You return to the US, then you go back to Fiji, right? Share with us, there are these pioneering findings that you had in the naturalistic study of the world and technology. Tell us, I know you could speak about this for a long, long time, but sort of the highlights. Can you share with everyone today highlights from your observations across time in Fiji?
Yeah. So Kathy, I was back in Fiji doing actually during fellowship. So I had finished my psychiatry residency, and I was back there, and actually the project that I was working on initially was in a different area, postnatal depression. But I learned when I was there that, and this is circa 1994, 1995, that the government of Fiji for the first time was going to allow broadcast television to be available to the residential areas. And this was huge. They were one of the last places on the planet to do this. And so I knew that everywhere, else in the world where there were TVs, there was some concern about media exposure and how that impacted young people. And I thought this was really important to follow along, partly because I felt confident that the Fijians would be protected by their, the many elements of their valuation of care and bodies, being well fed. I thought they'd be protected, and I thought it would be an opportunity to learn from, how things unfolded. So we, as TV was being introduced, we were able to put together a study. And at that time, it was, we didn't have too much time to do this. So we put together a study. It was a two-wave cohort study. And so we went to two schools, and we assessed eating pathology in 1995. And then in 1998, we went back to the same two schools, got the same age young women, Itauke, Fijian, and we assessed it again. And we were we understood that we were doing this in a way that that these concepts that were, this was the E26 actually, that we used sort of as our baseline assessment. We understood that self-report wouldn't necessarily be that accurate and people might misunderstand the question. So we wanted to choose an indicator for disordered eating that would be likely to generalize across very diverse cultural contexts. And so, one of the ones that we really zeroed in on was whether or not people were purging to manage their weight. And we only counted as positives if we were able to sit down with someone who ticked yes, I'm doing this, and and have a face-to-face conversation to establish that yes, this is exactly what she was doing, and it was in order to manage weight. And what we found in sort of when TV, right at the dawn of the TV era, no one was doing that. That was zero in our small group. By 1998, when we went back to do the reassessment, we had 11% of the young women were doing this. And remember, this is interview confirmed, purging
Right.
to manage.
11% are purging to manage weight following exposure to television. And what was on TV? What were they seeing?
Yeah, so really interesting question. So first of all, it's very limited content at the time. They had, it was about 6 hours a day of broadcasting, and the content was all repackaged, syndicated stuff, mostly from the US, some of it from Australia. The locally produced content was about 20 minutes of news that was repeated, once in the evening. And what I would say is the kind of stuff they were consuming was pretty prosaic. It was soap opera stuff, and you might remember Beverly Hills 90210 from way back, and that was one of the favorites. And what was so interesting about this, and what distinguished this from what they had already had access to, which is film, the films that were viewed prior to this were generally selected based on how entertaining they could be if you didn't speak English, right? So a lot of dancing and Bollywood stuff, and a lot of, car crashes and action movies. But with the television, they didn't offer that. And what they did offer are these soap operas where people could get to know a character, and that character would be in their living room or, someone else's living room usually. And they would have this relationship with the characters and sort of inhabit their lives and imagine what it would be like to be them. And what was so striking in that 1998 group was what the young women said about viewing TV, which they tended to view with friends or, a community. And they said, wow, everyone looks so different in your country, and they're all thin. And that was just so startling to them. And they started to equate the thinness with the lifestyle. And the lifestyle to them was, even, some of it looks quite glamorous, but even things like these teenagers have jobs. I'm going to study what they're doing, and I'm going to figure out how to get a job. And at the same time as you have the introduction of television, you had the rapid electrification of areas of Fiji that supported the tourist industry. So you start to have this rapid transition into even more of a cash economy where jobs really make a difference. But most of the people didn't have parents who had a job and, a wage, for example. And so they were looking to the TV characters as role models for how were they going to be successful as Fiji transitioned to a more modern economy.
What are they telling you about the advantages of, or what they imagined the advantages of pursuing a different body type compared to what they had grown up with?
Yeah. So, well, let me touch on that 1998 cohort and then I'm going to fast forward to 2007. So people, there was a sense in some of the interviews of profound demoralization, the sense that they were suddenly shown a view of the rest of the world and a mirror for themselves, and that they were different and they were not catching up with the rest of the world. And they also saw themselves as large. And this notion of, we've got to be competitive, maybe collectively, but also individually to get a job was really poignant and connected to the purging. When we did go back, of course, because we wanted to unpack this. And one of the things we weren't able to look at was, what was the dose effect of TV? Like, was it just TV, or was it something different? Was it how people consumed it? And what else was going on with these young people? So we went back to the communities that where the schools were, and of course wanted to present our findings and our concern. And it was really interesting. We started with what is often considered to be the stakeholders, older people, right? And they had a very different view than the young people did about some of this. And in the older committee members, there was one in particular who expressed concern with what he termed electric lies on TV. But they were concerned about how young people were consuming TV because of other risk behaviors, and mostly because of the sort of ways that young people they felt weren't respecting traditions and customs. So that was their, understandably, that was their main concern. On the other hand, they said, look, TV allows us to not, we can be connected with the rest of the world. We get news. Some of this is really valuable. So it wasn't, but they were curious too. And they said, okay, let's find out more. And so this time, Kathy, we wanted to get a much larger and representative sample. So we went to the Ministry of Education and we asked them for, to connect us with all of the schools within a linguistically homogeneous group. And they did, and the schools were really terrific in allowing us to recruit respondents. And we got, we had a good response rate, and we recruited 523 young women, Itauke Fijian women, for this study. And this is in 2007. And in this study, we were able to do a more sophisticated look at eating pathology. We used the EDEQ, but then we did an interview for people who had pertinent positives. And we also were able to validate that and in the local version. And we also, importantly, one of the healers who had been a participant in the focus group said to us, I think you really need to look at traditional herbal purgatives that young people are using. They're using it off-label, they're using it in secret, and they're using it to purge. And I've heard people are doing this for weight management. So we thought it was an important thing to add because, the EDEQ is formulated for other populations. And I'll cut to the chase here. So what we found in that very large sample, and very representative, was that among 523 women, in the last month, 222 of them had purged to manage weight in the last month.
Wow.
Right? So that obviously was an unexpected finding and interesting in many ways, because first of all, the parents, the stakeholders said, this isn't really a problem we have, right? So it was very invisible to them. Mm-hmm. But the other was when we dug into it a little more and asked these young women, so what's going on? Where did you get the purgatives and how? It turned out that many of them were doing it with the full permission and actually support of family members. So they my mother gives it to me, my aunt gives it to me. They're they're very concerned that I get a job. So what's interesting here is, the question, is that really psychopathology? And obviously the symptom is concerning, right? Because purging can be dangerous no matter how, whether it's a part of a disorder or not. But it seemed to be that there were social drivers that were operating to influence the, almost a significant minority of young women to purge, to manage their weight. And the weight management, in turn, was related to the hope that they would be successful in the wage economy.
Mm-hmm. So fascinating at many levels. One that occurs to me, Anne, as you're speaking, you're talking about the arrival of television, and it is the concerns around the arrival of television and the discussion about the double-edged sword of this technology are identical to today's generation's discussion around social media, right? So the television was that generation's discussion about technology and exposure and social media in its form. And I think it's just fascinating to think about how it gets replicated generationally. We'll get to that potentially, but more specifically, what I'm hearing you say, and what I want to call out and ask you to elaborate on, is in the course of this research career and your commitment over the long term in terms of getting to know a culture and a community and look at it from inside out, for which I should highlight, you've received numerous awards in terms of your research career. And a piece of that, I think, reflects your capacity to bring out a critical issue about our research approaches and global health, and how it is that conventional approaches and metrics and measurement that we have can, in fact, perpetuate certain mistaken ideas about risk and exposure in mental health generally, and specifically around eating disorders. That's a big idea. And so I want to ask you to unpack that a bit for us.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Kathy. Something I think about a lot because, I think about that earlier study, and I wonder if we had asked about herbal purgatives in that set of questions, would we have come away with a different understanding of what happened? In this case, you can see that the phenotype of disordered eating, if that's what, I want to be very careful not to over pathologize it, right? Because we have to, the kinds of symptoms that we saw in Fiji don't map on to what we see in the DSM. And if it's more of an OSFED picture. And when we do our epidemiologic studies in other regions of the world where the assessments were not developed by or for those populations, we run the risk of missing important local phenotypes that are locally salient and potentially clinically salient, but just don't show up with that particular kind of assessment. And, we can't know what we don't know all the time. And, so back to your point about the ethnographic work, there's value in doing that deep dive into understanding what is going on behind the scenes. What are people interested in? What is going on that may be distressing to them? And then somehow finding a way to capture that in the assessments we do. But we don't want to throw out the assessments we have. I mean, you'll notice I use the EDEQ. Thank you to Dr. Chris Fairburn for being gracious and sharing it. But we translated it, we back translated it, we put it in the local idiom. We were very careful around that. And it was a valuable way, it was a foundation of our understanding of what was going on there. Obviously, it had to be augmented with this purgative question. But this is, I think, back to your point, it begs the question of what else are we missing in the field? What else is invisible to us because we are using assessments that were developed for a very specific set of populations, usually, the Americas, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, UK. And think about the fact that if you talk about where are the most cases of eating disorders in the world, absolute number, not prevalence, it's going to be in China and India, right? Because they have the largest population. Right. And so if you think about, well, why is it that we would not call them why would we call them atypical if they didn't correspond to what we thought? They have more people than we do. And just by definition, the majority of cases in the world, we should be looking elsewhere in the world to at least evaluate what kind of presentations are locally meaningful.
And what I hear you saying is that what we learn today about eating disorders may be true today in a certain place for a certain group of people, but that we should know that what we know now is what we know now, and that in fact that story is a dynamic one, and that we also, if we think that if we pay attention to what we know and apply it everywhere, we're going to miss what we don't know in all of those places. Is that we need to bring what we know to these new fields and communities, but we also need to be, as you said, humble about what we don't know. Is that?
You put it so well, Kathy. And there's one more thing to that I would add, which is, and this gets us back to what's the common thread between ethnography and psychiatry, which is that we're trying to understand what lived experience is. And whereas it's useful to use quantitative methods and the 30,000 foot view and the constructs we've developed and apply them and see where they fit or don't fit, it's also imperative that we, on the ground, are listening to what people have to say. And what I haven't said yet today is that everything I understand about Fiji is because people in the community took the time to help me understand and correct my understanding. And I think that's the mindset we should all have as clinicians and researchers.
We started out, and you're saying that you thought you were going to be a linguist and that wasn't going to be. But actually, I think there's a way in which your love of language comes through time and again in the research you're doing, because you are so careful in understanding that how we talk about things and the language we use matters, and the way that people talk about their lived experience and understanding what do they mean by this term or this word. What does that mean coming from this person in this time is really about language in a certain way, or language is very much a part of this story. So I think you've been true to your love of language and just layered on the appreciation and depth of attention to a love of culture and people and lived experience and research methods, and created for so many of us a little bit of a glimpse of the story of Fiji that is specific to Fiji, but also has so many lessons for the whole field in terms of how we move forward with our understanding. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for teaching us, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Kathy. It's been really fun to talk about it, and I'll look forward to our next conversation too.